So my thesis looks at how Russian and Serbian politicians use nationalist rhetoric when they discuss Kosovo and Crimea. And Kosovo and Crimea are regions of great historical and religious significance and contested ownership today. And there are similarities in how Russian and Serbian politicians use nationalist rhetoric when they discuss the two regions, and there are similarities in the tendencies of Western scholars, analysts, and media to take such rhetoric at face value. And that leads to my central question, which is, does the nationalist rhetoric of politicians mean that nationalist belief drives policymaking? And I argue that although the nationalist rhetoric resonates with the general population, it's not nationalist belief that drives policymaking, but the political and strategic interests of the current politicians. The use of this rhetoric is strategic, and usage of these concepts is clearly traceable. They are used when it is seen as politically useful, and they are discarded when that usefulness fades. And consequently, taking this nationalist rhetoric at face value is highly problematic. And the data for this thesis comes in part from field research. I received fellowships to travel to Russia, Serbia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, where I conducted interviews with scholars, analysts, and ordinary people in Russian, Serbian, and English. And so, after the annexation of Crimea, Putin's rhetoric sparked fears that ethnic nationalism was driving Russian policy and that Russia would try to annex more territory in the name of protecting ethnic Russians. But ethnic nationalism is not feasible as official policy in the Russian context because of the complexity of Russian identity and the demographics of the Russian Federation. And Moscow's relations with Russian minorities abroad are highly dependent on context and history. And the idea that tactics that work in one place, such as Crimea, could easily be transferred elsewhere, such as, say, Estonia or Latvia, is highly problematic. And as the euphoria surrounding the Crimean annexation has faded within Russia, this nationalist rhetoric has disappeared from use, which suggests that these nationalist narratives were strategically used at the time of the annexation to justify Russian actions in Ukraine to a domestic audience. The Kremlin's endgame is likely much more nuanced than simply redrawing borders, and misinterpreting Putin's rhetoric is not conducive to discerning the Kremlin's true motivations or to countering Russian efforts at interference and meddling. In regard to Serbia and Kosovo, Kosovo is often portrayed as the cornerstone of Serbian identity because of events that took place in the Middle Ages. Serbian identity and history are often portrayed as fixed and unchanging from the Middle Ages to the present day. But the historical record disputes this notion. Kosovo and the myths of Kosovo as sacred only became significant to Serbian identity in the 19th century as Serbia won its independence from the Ottoman Empire. And Kosovo and the narratives of Kosovo's significance became part of a larger strategy that were utilized by Serbian politicians as Yugoslavia collapsed, and that continues to be used today. These politicians use Kosovo to divert attention from domestic developments in Serbia and to get concessions from the international community. They exploit tensions in the region, and they exploit Western fears of renewed regional conflict to incentivize the EU to facilitate Serbian membership. And although in recent years these politicians have turned away from sort of using the medieval myths, this rhetorical shift is further proof that using the myths was always strategic. Today these politicians want to appear as pro-European reformers, and evoking medieval myths is not conducive to that end. But if one looks beyond the political rhetoric, one can see that these politicians are continuing to use Kosovo as their predecessors have. They are continuing to exploit tensions in the region and divert attention away from the rollback of democratic progress within Serbia. Taking the Kosovo myths at face value is not conducive for understanding that Serbian attachment to Kosovo is about more than medieval history, and it's not conducive for understanding how Serbian politicians use Kosovo. Taking nationalist rhetoric at face value is to accept the simplistic ideas that politicians want their constituents to believe. It's not conducive for understanding complex questions of identity or violence or why states collapse. And the misconceptions about how conflict begins lead to misconceptions about how it can end. And this tragically plays out in the Balkans and currently in Ukraine. And at the end of the day, conclusions from studying nationalism and political rhetoric and ethnic politics resonate far beyond far-off countries like Kosovo and Crimea, they can resonate much closer to home as well. So thank you.